My name is Hayley Carlson. The program I'm in is the Masters of Public Policy at Johnson Shayama School of Graduate School. And the topic of my research is water policy in the Saskatchewan River Basin. I was looking at water policy narratives in the Saskatchewan River Basin, particularly, and the way I went about exploring those narratives and how they were influencing decision making in that space was doing a document analysis using NVivo primarily. Okay, so this is an interesting story. So I came to Johnson Shayama from a science background, and I really wanted to, I'd heard about this potential massive irrigation expansion in the river basin, and I wanted to do a cost-benefit analysis on that expansion. And as a previous scientist, that appealed to me because of all the facts and numbers. And then I started trying to actually get those facts and numbers. And I read a bunch of different resources and I went and talked to people. And the more I actually did that, the harder it was to find numbers that match. It seemed like everyone in that decision space was telling a different story about what was going on. So I phoned up my supervisor at that point, and this was about a year and a half after being in this program, and said, I don't think the cost-benefit analysis will work. I think what's really going on here is that there's people telling different stories, there's policy narratives happening, and I want to know what those are, and what the really interesting question is how are those influencing decision-making, and how is decision-making occurring according to what narrative is controlling decision-making primarily in that decision space. So that's, in that way, my methodology came very organically, because at that point I knew I needed to go in and kind of pull out those narratives. To gather my data, I went first and kind of took a year or so of informal research where I just really gave myself the space to take in what was really going on there and get a feel for the main stakeholder groups and what kind of different stories there were. I kind of had a sense of that before I began. Then I started to form a document catalog. So I had, at the end of this process, I had 134 documents in that catalog. And then I did some preliminary analytics on that catalog using NVivo. So I just did some frequency analysis based on stakeholder groups and kind of pulled out subgroups from that, what words popped up the most in these documents with certain stakeholder groups. I got a sense of what was interesting, what may be the most interesting stories out of those groups once I had taken that time for informal research and done those preliminary analytics. And then I really went in and I started to code. And I developed a coding guide to do this. It took me through coding. It asked 11 questions and it took me through coding. So at the end of the process, I had 11 parent nodes corresponding to those 11 questions in my coding guide. And then I took that and developed a profile for all kind of my main stakeholder groups. And then I went into 2 of those stakeholder groups and really pulled out quotes, did a more organic, qualitative analysis on that data and those documents to flesh out sort of that framework I had already developed with the coding guide. So that's what I did in my document analysis portion. So NVivo is a qualitative analysis software that allows you to look at documents and code for certain concepts. So if you're interested in, say, characters, which is a part of a narrative that a policy actor might tell, you can go in and see that this one person in this document is always held up as this hero character who kind of comes in and saves the day. So then NVivo allows you to go in and highlight that section of text and create a code. So then later when you're looking up where are all the heroes in all of these documents that I've coded and looked at, that specific phrase will show up in your codes at the end of the day. The primary stumbling block that I struggled with was I went into coding, and my understanding of qualitative research was very different from quantitative research. And if you look at a lot of the literature around qualitative research, it's very, those authors don't want to lean on that quantitative type of analysis where you're comparing things against some sort of objective framework. They argue that these concepts can't be really truly discovered outside of their own context and their own local place. So I went into coding with NVivo, which I wasn't very familiar with, assuming that I would just go through these documents and create codes, and then I'd be able to compare them at the end of the day. And very quickly, well, and maybe this was just my bias because I come from a science background, but I was immediately worried about reliability and validity. I wanted people to be able to, in a sense, be able to replicate what I did to a certain extent, and also compare it to some sort of outside, like what is a narrative? Was it just me going into these documents and creating these codes and defining what I thought a narrative was based on what I read? I wanted to have some kind of neat document that described what a narrative was and what key elements were that I could code for. So that at that point, and I had already started coding some of my documents, so at that point I thought, I need to create a coding guide for this. And I went and I did that based on the literature. And I had to check it against someone on my committee who was familiar with more qualitative research, because my primary supervisor is more of a quantitative researcher. So that was my main stumbling block. And I really struggled with that for about a couple months. I wasn't quite sure what to do. But yeah, the coding guide helped at the end of the day with that. To gather the documents that I did have in my document analysis, I did have sort of a sense for who the primary stakeholders were in that space just from the research I had done and the conferences and such I'd attended. But then it was a process of exhausting Google searchers at that point. I went in and I kind of decided on 12 stakeholder groups, and they had matched previous research done in that basin by other people, like roughly, it was the same. So I just kind of Google searched those groups that fell into those, like subgroups that fell inside those stakeholder groups. So like for the environment stakeholder group, it would be the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society or the Saskatchewan Environmental Society, that kind of thing. So it was at a point where I literally, when I stopped at the 134 documents in my document catalog, I wasn't getting anything new with Google searching. So that's kind of where the 134 comes from. I think that it would be very valuable to other sectors, to industry and government. Whether or not they would pursue it is another subject, another question. I think that this research would be more valuable in that context if I had leaned on the coding document a little bit more than I had. I wanted to stay true to the original interpretation and the intended meaning of the words and documents as much as I could. So I did just use that coding guide kind of as a framework and then fleshed it out more later with direct quotes, kind of trying to let the documents speak for themselves as much as possible. And, I have some experience in government, and that approach wouldn't be, I think, as palatable in a government context. I think having that coding guide and leaning on that a bit more, so you had a clear link between what you were saying about these documents and the coding guide and the codes, would make it easier to transfer kind of between those managerial levels or from the government to the public. It has to be easily understood. So in that context, and I think it would be valuable in a government context as well. All policymakers have to consult with different stakeholder groups. This is just a common practice in government and even in industry, consulting with different stakeholder groups when they're initiating a project or implementing new policy. So usually that consultation happens in sort of a lot of, the government does receive criticism for that consultation happening in sort of a cursory way. It's not really meaningful at the end of the day, a lot of stakeholders claim. So this research helps to get out those stories that these different groups are telling, and hopefully allows the policy analyst to position themselves differently according to that information. So in a discrete consultation, a government person would go out and get that information and then take it back, and they do that however many times with however many different groups, and they take that back and try to integrate it. But this research allows you to see all of them at once, and it can also allow stakeholders to be brought in more to the process so they can hear other stories, hear what's going on in other areas instead of just direct having that, I guess, vertical communication. There can be more lateral, horizontal communication between stakeholder groups. And that's what I see this kind of research contributing to. I would recommend, if you're not familiar with the software, I would highly recommend taking a course on it. Sometimes it's hard to plan, because I also think it's important to allow yourself to have the space to be flexible. So if you do start out thinking you're going to use a quantitative methodology or a qualitative sort of oriented methodology, and then you switch because you feel like it's more feasible or more true to what you're doing, then that's fair. I would try to spend the time, and if I was going to do this over again, I would spend the time to take a course on that software and take maybe a more specific course on qualitative research in general, just so I really had even gone through a few examples, like assignments, and really could get more out of it than I did get. And I also would encourage, I feel like a lot of, maybe this won't be a popular response, but I feel like a lot of graduate students are put in sort of tough situations where they have certain deadlines to meet, or they have certain data they're forced to kind of use, or something like that. And that's, just sort of the nature of this work. But I also think it's important to do your research with integrity and give yourself the space and time to be able to explore what the problem you're exploring in a real way, in a way that is actually getting to the bottom of things in that decision space. So that would be, and I feel like a lot of graduate students are a bit apprehensive about doing that. So I would recommend doing that. Try it out.